At the turn of the 20th century, the Philippine archipelago entered a new era under American military rule, and with that shift came a powerful transformation in how people spoke, learned, and understood the world. Prior to 1898, Spanish colonial influence had shaped everyday life and language throughout the islands, but it was the arrival of U.S. forces that introduced an entirely different linguistic dynamic. Alongside soldiers and administrators came a cadre of teachers, arriving on the USS Thomas and its follow-on vessels, charged with creating a public education system unlike anything the previous regime had attempted. Hundreds of these educators, later remembered simply as the Thomasites, were dispatched across provinces, villages, and towns to establish schools and teach English to Filipino children who had not encountered the language before. Within a single generation, literacy rates climbed rapidly. Government offices, courts, commerce, and institutions of higher learning began employing English as the dominant language of formal communication. In an astonishingly short time frame, what had once been foreign speech became the key to upward mobility for a new generation of Filipinos chasing opportunities in a newly globalizing world. The psychological impact of this shift was profound. English quickly became synonymous with modernity, sophistication, and prestige in the emerging Philippine society, while native languages such as Tagalog, deeply rooted in local communities and traditions, were gradually pushed into the background of public life. At first, Tagalog did not vanish, nor was it displaced entirely. Instead, a complex linguistic balance emerged, a sociolinguistic duality scholars later termed diglossia. In everyday practice, many Filipinos became proficient bilinguals, using English for matters of governance, business, academia, and legal affairs, while reserving Tagalog and other indigenous tongues for family life, informal communication, and cultural expression. Yet this functional separation had consequences. Highly educated Filipinos, for example, often found themselves fluent in technical terms only in English, with equivalent Tagalog vocabulary either underdeveloped or absent from formal discourse. Rather than erasure, English introduced a layered linguistic texture that both complemented and complicated traditional vernacular use. What resulted was not a simple replacement, but a complex coexistence, where Tagalog was reshaped by its contact with English, and where speakers learned to navigate multiple linguistic worlds daily. One of the most visible effects of this linguistic interplay was the unprecedented influx of English loanwords into everyday Philippine speech. Before the American period, centuries of Spanish rule had already left a rich palette of borrowed vocabulary throughout Philippine languages. But what followed was different in scale, speed, and character. New domains of life, technology, science, politics, entertainment, organization, and sport required terminology that simply did not exist in Tagalog. Words like computer, television, meeting, manager, and countless others were adopted wholesale, often retaining their original English forms rather than being nativized or phonologically transformed. This created a more obvious foreign imprint on the language than earlier Spanish borrowings, which had centuries to adapt and absorb. Beyond vocabulary, the structure of language itself began to shift. Educated Filipino speakers increasingly constructed sentences influenced by English word order, and patterns of formal discourse adopted rhetorical techniques common in American education. These changes, while subtle at first, laid the groundwork for a uniquely modern Tagalog that bore both indigenous and imported features, a linguistic hybrid that would define communication throughout the 20th century. Mass media played a surprisingly central role in standardizing and broadcasting this evolving form, Tagalog, to millions of listeners and viewers scattered across islands and regions. Beginning in the 1930s, the Philippine film industry emerged as a crucial cultural force, producing movies with dialogue that later became touchstones for everyday speech. After World War II, cinema flourished, bringing a standardized version of Manila Tagalog into theaters nationwide, reaching audiences who spoke entirely different local languages at home. Movie stars became more than entertainers. They became linguistic icons whose pronunciation, slang, and expressive habits set norms for informal speech throughout the country. Radio broadcasting followed suit. Programs ranging from drama serials to news bulletins penetrated rural and urban communities alike, creating a shared auditory experience that transcended regional variation. The Tagalog spoken on radio served as a de facto standard, one that many Filipinos aspired to understand and emulate. Through these media channels, a common linguistic reference point emerged, one that helped unify a nation of diverse tongues and reinforced Tagalog's central role in a rapidly changing cultural landscape. Yet the elevation of Tagalog to national prominence was not without controversy, and when the 1935 Constitution mandated the development of a national language based on an existing Philippine language, the decision stirred deep resentment in many regions. Speakers of languages such as Cebuano, Ilonggo, Hiligaynon, and others viewed the choice of Tagalog as a privileging of Manila and Central Luzon at the expense of other major linguistic communities. For them, the policy smacked of cultural imperialism, imposing one group's language over many others. These tensions did not just reflect differences in speech. They touched on deeper issues of identity, power, and access to opportunity. Non-Tagalog regions felt forced into learning a language that was not their own in schools and government offices, even as their native tongues were marginalized in official contexts. Economic grievances soon intertwined with linguistic politics, as Manila's dominance in commerce, education, and governance was already a source of regional inequality. In attempts to mitigate resentment, policymakers renamed Tagalog to Filipino in 1959 and later reaffirmed that name in 1987, promoting it as a language meant to incorporate elements from all Philippine languages. But critics pointed out that despite the inclusive intent, the grammatical backbone remained fundamentally Tagalog, leaving fundamental questions about equitable representation unresolved. Despite the rebranding of Tagalog into Filipino, linguistic inequality persisted, and for many Filipinos, the name change did little to address the structural imbalance. Although the official line emphasized that Filipino would eventually draw vocabulary from all Philippine languages, in practice, it remained largely Tagalog in grammar and core structure. The integration of words from Cebuano, Ilocano, Hiligaynon, and other regional tongues was often limited to surface vocabulary rather than deeper syntactic inclusion. This symbolic gesture did not satisfy critics who viewed the change as cosmetic, masking the continued dominance of Manila-based Tagalog. Nevertheless, regional languages remained resilient. In their respective territories, they retained daily utility spoken at home, in local markets, churches, and radio stations. Community media in Visayas and Mindanao, for example, broadcasted in their own languages, helping maintain linguistic diversity amid mounting pressure to conform to Tagalog and English norms. This dual reality of official unification and on-the-ground diversity revealed a unique linguistic ecology, where competing forces of national identity and regional pride played out in classrooms, conversations, and public spaces across the archipelago. Education became one of the most significant arenas where this linguistic complexity was both cultivated and challenged. While Filipino was promoted as the national language across schools, English maintained a firm grip on instruction in key academic subjects. Science, mathematics, and technical disciplines were overwhelmingly taught in English, which created a cognitive framework in which complex reasoning was more comfortably expressed in a foreign language. For many students, this bifurcation created internal dissonance. They might discuss personal matters fluently in Filipino or a regional tongue, yet struggled to articulate academic arguments unless switching to English. As a result, the Philippines developed a norm of functional multilingualism, with students expected to operate fluently across 3 or more languages, depending on context. Filipino became the medium for cultural and national discourse, English for intellectual and professional advancement, and regional languages for intimate and familial communication. This linguistic juggling act, while often impressive, also deepened class divisions. Those who mastered English gained disproportionate access to higher education and global opportunities, while those rooted in regional tongues faced systemic disadvantage in competitive spheres. The rise of the call center industry in the early 2000s further altered the country's linguistic terrain. As the Philippines positioned itself as a global hub for customer service outsourcing, fluency in American-style English became not just an asset, but a job requirement. Hundreds of thousands of young Filipinos trained rigorously in American pronunciation, idioms, and even cultural scripts, equipping themselves to converse seamlessly with clients from the United States and beyond. This sector did more than boost the economy. It entrenched a new variety of English use that blended technical fluency with localized accent suppression. Many employees began code switching effortlessly between English and Filipino in their social circles, importing phrases, speech rhythms, and even slang from their professional environments into everyday conversations. This linguistic cross-pollination created a distinct sociolect within the urban workforce, sometimes celebrated for its modernity, other times criticized as evidence of cultural mimicry. The call center boom thus reinforced English as an economic gatekeeper, while also raising questions about linguistic authenticity, identity, and the costs of globalization on native speech forms. At the same time, the explosion of social media ushered in a new chapter in the evolution of Tagalog, especially among the country's digitally native youth. Platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram became informal arenas where Tagalog, previously confined to spoken interactions, found new life as a written language. These digital conversations developed their own syntax, spelling conventions, and stylistic quirks. English and Tagalog intermingled freely, giving rise to Taglish, an expressive blend that shifted fluidly between registers. Online culture accelerated the creation of slang, with memes, trends, and viral posts shaping linguistic norms at a rapid pace. A particularly notable trend in the late 2000s was Jujaman spelling, where letters and numbers replaced conventional spelling rules, forming a distinctive youth subculture, often mocked but rarely understood. Simultaneously, Kanyo speech, heavily infused with English and associated with Manila's upper class, became both a linguistic phenomenon and a target of satire. These forms of digital expression, while often controversial, signaled an era of generational language reinvention where playfulness, resistance, and identity intersected in the written word. As online communities grew, so did the political potential of the Filipino language in public discourse. Hashtags, viral commentaries, and online movements increasingly embraced Filipino as the primary medium, reclaiming spaces that had long been dominated by English-educated elites. Social media empowered grassroots political participation, allowing everyday citizens to articulate grievances, advocate for reforms, and challenge power structures in a language that resonated more broadly with the population. Movements on platforms like Twitter and Facebook used Filipino not only for accessibility but to assert national identity in a digital age. Campaigns spread quickly across socioeconomic lines, mobilizing support and debate in a language both emotional and strategic. This democratization of language reflected a broader shift where Filipino was no longer confined to symbolic cultural roles, but began to function as a legitimate tool for intellectual, civic, and ideological engagement. In reclaiming public space through their native tongue, Filipinos demonstrated how language could be both a mirror of the past and an instrument for shaping the future. In contemporary music, especially in hip-hop and spoken word, the Filipino language continues to evolve with intensity and innovation. Artists like Francis Magalona pioneered a form of rap that combined national pride with linguistic dexterity, showing that Filipino could be a powerful vehicle for modern artistic expression. His legacy influenced a new generation of lyricists who fearlessly mixed Filipino, English, and regional dialects in their verses. These musicians redefined language as a space for defiance, humor, storytelling, and social critique. Words born on the street often entered mainstream conversations, spreading through lyrics, music videos, and live performances. Popular slang terms, rhythmic expressions, and reworked idioms emerged from these cultural circles and rippled into youth vernacular nationwide. The blending of languages in these songs didn't dilute meaning, it amplified it, making lyrics resonate with multiple audiences at once. This multi-layered communication reflected the complexity of Filipino identity in a globalized, multilingual society. As artists pushed linguistic boundaries, they also reasserted control over how Filipino, as a language and a concept, could represent not just tradition, but revolution, fluidity, and cultural ownership. The media landscape, particularly in film and television, has also played a central role in normalizing the language patterns of everyday Filipinos. Gone are the days when dialogue followed rigid, formal Filipino. Instead, screenwriters now strive for authenticity, mirroring the natural code switching that occurs in real life. Television dramas and blockbuster films incorporate English phrases fluidly, reflecting the linguistic habits of urban viewers, especially in Manila and other metropolitan areas. This embrace of Taglish is no longer seen as careless or incorrect, it's celebrated as real. As such, characters in scripted media no longer act as idealized speakers of a purified language, but as believable mirrors of a society navigating linguistic hybridity. This change has validated the way many Filipinos already spoke, giving formal recognition to patterns that were previously dismissed as improper. By adopting the lived language of the streets, offices, and classrooms, mainstream media helped shift public perception of what constituted correct or proper Filipino. It redefined linguistic legitimacy not by textbooks but by lived usage, anchoring Taglish as an evolving norm that reflects cultural truth. Educational policy, too, has grappled with the multilingual reality of the Philippine population. Recent decades have seen the Department of Education experimenting with mother tongue-based multilingual education, especially in early childhood learning. In this model, children are taught in their native language during foundational years before transitioning into Filipino and English for broader communication. The policy acknowledges research showing that literacy and comprehension develop best when children begin in the language they first spoke at home. At the same time, Filipino remains a mandated subject and medium for certain areas of instruction, while English dominates science and technical education. This tiered language structure reflects the country's ongoing attempt to balance linguistic inclusivity with global competitiveness. Yet challenges remain: lack of resources, teacher training, and standardized materials in many regional languages continue to hinder full implementation. Despite these hurdles, the recognition of local languages within the national curriculum represents a significant philosophical shift, that a child's first language is not a barrier to success, but a bridge toward cognitive development and cultural preservation. The continued movement of people within and beyond the Philippines has further complicated Tagalog's role. Internal migration to Metro Manila and other urban centers has turned Tagalog into a de facto lingua franca, allowing people from different regions to communicate. This shift, however, often comes at the cost of regional languages, which may decline as second or third generations grow up in predominantly Tagalog-speaking environments. Meanwhile, the overseas Filipino worker OFW phenomenon has created linguistic diasporas abroad. Migrants maintain connections through Filipino and regional languages, while also adopting foreign words from host countries. These linguistic imports often re-enter the Philippines through returned migrants or social media, adding new layers to the national lexicon. Hybrid expressions, often humorous or deeply contextual, spread quickly. Language becomes a living record of movement, adaptation, and resilience. This mobility reinforces a key feature of Philippine linguistic culture: its porousness. Whether through migration, technology, or media, Tagalog and its counterparts continue absorbing, transforming, and transmitting meaning in response to shifting social currents. Today, the story of Tagalog, and by extension, Filipino, is not one of linear progression or dominance, but of continuous negotiation. It sits at the intersection of history, politics, identity, and aspiration. Its evolution has been shaped by colonization, migration, globalization, and resistance, while its rise to national language status created friction with regional tongues. It also facilitated broader national communication. Simultaneously, English remains deeply entrenched in education, governance, and economics, offering access while perpetuating inequality. The Filipino linguistic landscape is thus not a battleground of right and wrong tongues, but a complex ecosystem where languages serve distinct, sometimes overlapping functions. Tagalog did not replace regional languages, nor did it remain untouched by foreign influence. Instead, it transformed, reflecting a people constantly adapting, without erasing their roots. Whether spoken in the cadence of a protest chant, woven into the rhyme of a rap verse, or shared in the intimacy of a family joke, Filipino continues to evolve. Its strength lies not in purity, but in its capacity to hold contradiction, creativity, and community all at once.